Hey guys, so in today's video I want to talk about the 40 things that all religions seem to share in common. Now when I say all religions, keep in mind that has a caveat. I mean, all religions can't possibly share all 40 of these points, but these are 40 tendencies or 40 things that we tend to see in the majority of religions. When we look out there at the diversity of beliefs that exist in the world, it's easy to only focus on the diversity, the differences, the distinctions, right? But when we really get close to religion and we really begin to understand the perennial philosophy, we can see that in fact a lot of these religions share a lot of similar themes. So, number one is the divine nature of consciousness. Now, this is something that we see primarily within Hinduism, Buddhism, and in a more metaphorical or symbolic way within Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. It's this idea that the awareness that is looking through our eyes and listening through our ears is divine. Now, this was something that was, I think, rather difficult for Western religious communities to identify, and that's large in part due to the fact that there's been a change in language. You see, when Hinduism and Buddhism came into the West and people started to get introduced to those ideas, it was almost automatic for people to use the word consciousness to describe the things that Buddhists and Hindus were talking about when they would talk about this divine awareness that fills all things. But traditionally within the West, we don't use this word consciousness. We use the word spirit instead. Consciousness is actually a relatively new word that was invented only a few hundred years ago. But when we look at most traditional societies, especially within Western civilization, we see this word spiritus or spirit, pneuma or ruach in Hebrew. And in all instances, what this describes is breath, the breathing of our breath. Now, for ancient people, it was recognized that when a person stops breathing, they essentially lose consciousness. If you hold your breath long enough, you'll eventually pass out. So the conclusion was that consciousness was the result of breathing, that breath and air were saturated, as it were, with awareness. This was the Spirit of God. In the book of Job, it says that if God were to withdraw his breath from all living things, they would cease to be. Now, this leads us into point number two, the idea of He is, or the great I Am. Now, this is something that we see specifically described in the Bible as well as within the Hindu Upanishads. In both instances, God is referred to as He is, or the great I Am. We see this within Buddhism as well, but Buddhists don't really use the word God, and we'll look at that perhaps later on. Instead, they emphasize the importance of the Buddha nature that dwells within. But the essential idea here is that if consciousness is divine, then there is, as it were, a kind of divine nature within each and every one of us. And this is ultimately the root of who we are. It is the universal I Am. I once heard actually a lovely Buddhist description where it said, you can always see where God is because every time you speak to someone, they'll say, it is I. It's this idea that God is the I, the self that dwells within everyone, within every living thing.
If this God is God, we would live on every mountain, in every valley. He would not be only the God of Israel or Ishmael alone, but of all men. It is said He created all men in His image, and He would dwell in every heart, in every mind, in every soul.
So the Spirit of God, the consciousness of God fills all things, and as a consequence, God's name is He is, or I Am. Now, one of the things that we see among all religions, and this is truly a universal, I would challenge somebody to find a religion that contradicts this one. In every religion, without exception, there's a great deal of significance placed on the importance of dreams. Dreams, visions, altered states of consciousness, these describe experiences of entering an alternative realm. You just have to imagine living thousands of years ago without any scientific technology. I mean, how did people obtain meaningful information about the world? Well, they would fly in dreams. They would explore the mountaintop. They would go up above the clouds, right? They would explore the world through the mediation of dreams. And so as a consequence, many shamans, mystics, and prophets were exploring the nature of mind. In many instances, they thought that they were exploring the natural world, that they were exploring the material world around us, but in reality, what we realize now is that in fact they were exploring the nature of mind. And this leads us to the next point, the fourth point, which is the significance of dream interpretation. This obviously follows from the former point. We see it within the Bible when Joseph is in the land of Egypt and he says that the Lord is the one who interprets dreams. We see it in Buddhism, we see it in Hinduism, we see it in Native American spirituality and within the tribes of Africa. Now, number 5 is prophecy or precognition, and this naturally flows, and through this video I'm going to try to do that, where each point will naturally flow from the previous one. We see that it's a universal experience that people who explore dreams and altered states of consciousness describe having visions or dreams about the future. This is referred to as precognitive dreams or precognition. I'm reminded in Buddhism there's this wonderful prophecy that says when the iron bird flies and horses run on wheels, then the message of the Buddha will come to the red man. This was the description of Buddhism coming to America. It was a prophecy that was given hundreds of years ago. We see similar things within the Bible, prophecies, predictions about the future. The Old Testament prophets predicted the destruction of Israel at the hands of Sennacherib and Assyria in 722, and they also predicted the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, and Jesus successfully predicted the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So we see throughout genuine religious traditions this emphasis on having precognitive visions about the future. Another favorite example I'm reminded of are the visions of Sitting Bull, who defeated Custer just down in the United States to the south of where I live. It's said that Sitting Bull had a vision during the Sundance, and he saw that his people would defeat the white man at the Battle of Custer, and that's exactly what happened.
Then he had another vision. The soldiers came again to attack his people. As many as grasshoppers, he said. But this time, they were upside down, their horses' hooves in the air, their hats tumbling to the ground as they rode into the Lakota camp. On the evening of June 24th, Sitting Bull made his way to a ridge that overlooked the encampment. There he made offerings to the Great Spirit and prayed for the protection of his people.
Wakhan Tonka, pity me. In the name of the people, I offer you this sacred pipe. Wherever the sun, the moon, the earth, the 4 points of the wind, there you are, always. Save the people, I beg you. We want to live. Guard us against all misfortune. Pity me. Tatchanka Yotchanka.
Reno's men crossed the river, formed a thin skirmish line, and began firing into one edge of the village, assuming that Custer would reinforce them. They were soon outnumbered. Reno ordered a retreat. The soldiers were falling into the village, just as Sitting Bull's vision had suggested they would. More Indian warriors swarmed out of the village.
The next point is Therianthropes, angels, devas, gods, and star beings. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a fascinating thing that when you journey through all the different religions of the world, what you find is this theme centered around these spirit beings, these celestial beings, these transcendent beings, and quite often they're described as having the heads of animals and the bodies of men, or the bodies of animals and the heads of men. These are the sphinxes of ancient Egypt, or the cherubim and the seraphim of the Bible or the gods of Hinduism. Among the First Nations people of the Americas, they were described as star beings. It was said that sometimes the star beings would come down and visit the Aboriginal communities. One of my favorite examples of this is in the Greek magical papyri, where it describes a ceremony, a magical spell, and the text advises the practitioner, saying if you perform the spell correctly, you'll see one of the stars dislodge itself from the firmament and then come down and stand before you. You know, it was this sense that the stars were really people somehow. You know, and this really persists into our time, but in a new kind of form, in the form of extraterrestrials and these sorts of things. Many psychoanalysts and perennial philosophers have suggested that this alien phenomena may in fact just simply be a new projection of the unconscious mind.
Whoa!
Point number 7 is the Trickster. Now this one is something that really, in some sense, I think has been lost on Western man for quite some time. But it's this sense that the divine, the transcendent, has these trickster qualities, these mischievous qualities. It doesn't matter where we go in the world, we find that the most ancient and the most aboriginal and traditional societies have these stories about a trickster deity. You know, you have coyote among the Native Americans and tricksters in Africa, and stories of tricksters even in Australia among the Aborigines, right? We even see this quality in Yahweh, the God of the Bible, when he confounds the language of the people at the Tower of Babel and disperses them all around the world. Even in the Quran, it says that God could have made all of humanity one, united in religion, but God decided to confuse. He decided to spread humanity and divide us in order to test us against one another. And then it says in the Quran that at the end of the age, God will decide between us and let us know about those things over which we differ. Number 8 is meditation and visualization. Now this really ties in again with dreams and altered states of consciousness, but we see among most of the religious traditions of the world this idea of pursuing a vision quest or going out into the wilderness and trying to obtain a certain kind of an experience in an altered state of consciousness. Now this ties in as well with visualizations. Among Buddhists, there's a great deal of emphasis placed on meditating and visualizing various different scenarios. You'll visualize the Buddha, or you'll visualize different dakinis and things of this kind. I even talk about this in my book, The Way of the Dream, where when I was a Christian and I would pray and I would lift my hands in the air, you know, I would see these visualizations in my mind of Jesus and God and the angels, you know, and eventually sometimes these visualizations, spurred on by the feelings, would almost seem to acquire a life of their own, as if it was independent of my will and no longer the result of my willful imagining. This really helps to blur the line between what's real, what's dream, and what's illusion. And this is really the cornerstone of the religious experience. Point number 9, the spiritual body. Now this is something that we see mostly within Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, a little bit within Judaism, and perhaps even within Hinduism to a touch. But it's this idea that in death, when people enter paradise, they obtain some kind of a spiritual body. You know, in my video about eschatology, I talked about this, how St. Paul describes us as having this spiritual body, this body that's free of old age, sickness, and death. After the resurrection of Jesus, you know, Jesus appears and disappears at a whim. In Buddhism, this is referred to as the Sambhogakaya body. This is the body of the Buddha that is filled with enjoyment and can move through the realm of dreams. We see this within Islam, when Islam says that on the day of the resurrection, that an obese man will weigh no more than the wing of a mosquito. So this point from Islam really takes us into point 10, which is the weightlessness of spirit. So Islam says that an obese man will weigh no more than the wing of a mosquito on the day of resurrection. And in the Upanishads, specifically the Mandukya Upanishad, we read, the second condition, Tejasa, is the dreaming state of consciousness. One's attention is fixed on internal phenomena. The subtle world of dreams is solitary. One goes there alone. The phenomena of dreams are made from light. They have no weight. So there's this sense that phenomena in dreams possess no weight. The stuff of dreams is weightless. In fact, I had an experience of this myself. I had a dream where I was trying to lift this box, and and everyone around me was working at it, and I was straining, trying to lift it up, but it was clear that I wasn't lifting anything, and I was really pushing and straining because I was embarrassed about the fact that I wasn't taking any weight. And I remember the fella standing next to me kind of had this look on his face because he knew that, you know, my straining was more of an act than anything, right? I didn't want to appear as if I wasn't trying, but the truth is the phenomena in dreams are weightless, hence you can fly. I'm inclined to think that this is why most ancient people always concluded that God was in heaven. It's this idea of that the physical stuff of the earth is heavy and gross. You know, water and earth is heavy. Earth and fire tend to ascend up into the ether, and then above the clouds in the sky was the stuff of dreams, you see. Point number 11 is miraculous abilities, and this again is a universal. It's fascinating. Every culture that you look at, spiritually accomplished individuals who have achieved a certain level of spiritual realization and self-discipline, seem to be able to manipulate the waking world as if it's much more like a dream, right? Jesus walks on water, the Buddha walks on rainbow bridges, you know, all these sorts of things. It's the sense that for the spiritually enlightened, the boundary between what's real and what's a dream blurs, and they behave in the waking world as if it is only ever a dream. In fact, there's a wonderful story in the book of Acts that describes St. Peter having a vision in a dream and then waking up in the midst of it and realizing that in fact it's real. This brings us to point 12, the idea of bilocation or fast-footedness. Within Hinduism, these are referred to as the siddhis. It's this idea that the spiritual individual can seemingly move at will across any distance in space. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says to Nicodemus, anyone who is born of the Spirit is like the wind. You hear the sound that it makes, but you don't know where it comes from or where it's going. He says, so it is with everyone born of the Spirit. And we see in the book of Acts that one of Jesus' disciples, Philip, is sent by an angel to baptize the Ethiopian, and then it says that the Spirit of the Lord took him, and he just disappears. In the 1960s, people reported this about St. Padre Pio. They said he would be in one place and then seemingly be somewhere else miles away only a few minutes later, and people would report seeing him.
Some of the most extraordinary stories are about his bilocation, that is, his apparent ability to be in two places at once, on occasion even to hold up the passage of time. After he received the stigmata, he never left San Giovanni Rotondo. Yet there is an army of witnesses to swear that they saw him in many different parts of the world. And since his death, people are still unexpectedly finding themselves in his presence. Padre Pio's appearances of this kind are usually to people in need. Peter Barrett, in the army at the end of the war, found himself in San Giovanni and went to confession to Padre Pio and subsequently served his Mass. Not long ago, in Greenwich Hospital, meeting the parents of a badly injured boy, he gave them a picture of Padre Pio and the message, pray, hope, and don't worry. 2 weeks later, he met the parents of the injured boy, and they told him that their son was being discharged, fit and well. The mother, very grateful, said,
She said, I wonder, she said, could you give that priest, she said, our sincere thanks that was with you. And I didn't want to embarrass her to say which priest, but I knew for a fact that I was on my own there. And she said, he was very like, she said, the priest on the picture that you showed me, she said. But she said, would you please give him our sincere thanks?
The priest she saw was, of course, Padre Pio. Margaret Neal recently had this experience in San Giovanni.
Our spiritual director on the pilgrimage, coming round, giving each person the host. I saw him give my friend Kathleen the host, and then when he came to me, he just passed me, and I looked forward, and I saw this other priest walking forward with a chalice raised in his hand. I realized that it was Padre Pio himself who was giving me Holy Communion.
An American squadron leader claims that during the war, Padre Pio appeared before his plane in the sky above San Giovanni Rotondo and turned back the bombing raid. At the time, he had never even heard of Padre Pio and was only able to put a name to his vision when he saw Padre Pio in San Giovanni Rotondo several years later. Padre Pio was also reported to have been seen in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome on more than one occasion, and to have visited the dying Vicar General of the Diocese of Salto in Uruguay.
In Buddhism, this is described as fast-footedness. In fact, one of my favorite stories about the 16th Karmapa was one in which his disciple took him up to get changed in a room. And 16th Karmapa walked into the room and closed the door, and the disciple was waiting outside. And then he heard people starting to come in, and 16th Karmapa still hadn't emerged. And he hears 16th Karmapa talking downstairs, and there's only one room in and out. There's only one door in and out of this room. And so the disciple, he makes his way downstairs and he sees 16th Karmapa, but he didn't see him leave the room. And then 16th Karmapa, it said that he caught the eye of this disciple and then went, "Oh, I forgot you were waiting outside the room." As if for 16th Karmapa there was no big deal to just, be in one place and then suddenly be somewhere else. Really strange. This is described in Hinduism as prapti. It's this ability to move anywhere in space. Point number 13 is the idea of judgment in the afterlife. This is something that we really see universal. This is extraordinary how common it is. Of course, in Christianity, we talk about the judgment that an individual has to face in the afterlife after dying. We also talk about judgment at the end of the world, at the end of the age. In Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, the Tibetan Book of the Dead says that when an individual dies, they must face all the Buddha families, and the Buddha families test them with emanations of pure light. And if they can endure the purity of that light without succumbing to pain or discomfort, then they will prove themselves worthy of the presence of these enlightened Buddhas. But if instead they're found unworthy of that light, then they descend into the Bardo of rebirth in order to be cast back into another realm. In Hinduism, we hear descriptions of Yama, the Lord of Death, judging the souls of the dead. Even within ancient Egyptian mythology, it was said that Anubis would weigh the heart of a dead Egyptian against the feather of the goddess of order, and if the heart was found heavier than the feather of Maat, then the heart was given to the crocodile god, who would then eat it, and the soul of the dead Egyptian would burn in the lake of fire as punishment for his sin. And this takes us into point 14, afterlife cleansing. Now within Catholicism, this exists in the concept of purgatory, the idea that if an individual dies without being sufficiently spiritually purified, then they have to endure a fire cleansing. The Eastern Orthodox also teach this, but in a slightly different way. They don't think of purgatory, I think, as being so drawn out. It's a much more immediate experience as far as I can tell. But within Buddhism, we see a very similar concept in the Bardo, this idea that an individual must endure the consequences of their karma in the afterlife before being worthy of rebirth, of moving on to the next life. And this really takes us into point 15, the reality of ghosts. Now, it's interesting how there is one religion that I'm aware of that actually denies the existence of ghosts, and these are evangelical Christians. And it's really strange because ghosts are in the Bible. Saul goes to the witch of Endor, and the ghost of Samuel is conjured up. But the majority of religions, pretty much everybody else, accepts the reality of the existence of ghosts. In fact, in Catholic tradition, ghosts were usually seen as souls who were stuck in purgatory. You see that even in the works of Shakespeare, where the ghosts of the souls are released from purgatory and allowed to wander for a time on earth to give them some reprieve, some relief from the torments of purgatory. And so it's usually felt that ghosts are somehow souls caught in between. In Buddhism, ghosts are considered another form of life. They're referred to as living in the hungry ghost realm, where they're tormented by their attachments to their former life. If an individual dies and holds on too tight, then they simply can't move on, and they find themselves entrapped in the hungry ghost realm. And we see this even within popular culture here within the West. Point number 16, death, resurrection, and reincarnation. Now it's really interesting how most of the time when you talk about resurrection and reincarnation, people always focus on the differences. They say, well, which is it, reincarnation or resurrection, right? But really, I think maybe we fuss over this a little bit too much, because if you really look at what the what the ideas are fundamentally saying. They're saying that after death we inherit a new body. Now, whether that body comes about as a result of a resurrection, or if that body comes about as a result of reincarnation, you know, I'm not personally too worried about it myself. It emphasizes the point that after death we must obtain some new kind of body. So in Christianity it's said that one inherits a spiritual body if they've been found worthy of heaven, but if they're condemned to hell, they also inherit a kind of spiritual body with which they're tormented in Hades. In Islam it's said that the souls who burn in hell are given fresh skins so that they can be burned off all over again. Quite horrific. But even within Buddhism it's said that, you know, you can be born into a hell realm. In Buddhist teaching, the idea is that you're not sent to hell where your soul is tormented, you're reincarnated in hell. You're given a body and then consequently tormented in this horrific place. And point 17, progress toward awakening. This again is something that we see in pretty much all religions, excluding, you know, perhaps some branches of fundamentalism, you know, Christian fundamentalism or Islamic fundamentalism. But in most religions, there is a sense that an individual must progress along a path, that they must make their way towards sainthood, that, you know, getting to heaven is not just the result of belonging to a little club. It's rather strange how, you know, this fundamentalist and kind of thinking of saying, well, you're going to heaven as long as you're in our club, is so pervasive, because it's really kind of a weird idea. You know, most religions seem to understand that in order to achieve something spiritually, one must really work at it. One must achieve these things by attaining a higher state of consciousness. And point number 18, which is really tied to 17, which is the centrality of discipline. Pretty much every religion, in fact, I would confidently say, in fact, every religion around the world emphasizes the importance of self-discipline, self-restraint, cutting off oneself from the desires of the world, putting off eating, putting off sex, putting off all these things which normally sustain the body. And in some sense, I think that this is even part and parcel with preparing oneself for confrontation with death, when the body starts to break down and can no longer eat and sleep properly and do all of these things. It's in order to discipline one in order to face that situation, but it also helps to bring an individual into a much deeper experience of altered states of consciousness. People often report that when they haven't eaten for an extended period of time, they'll have vivid and intense dreams, so real sometimes they can't tell the difference between waking and dreaming. And this brings up point 19, the toxicity of desire. We see this especially in Buddhism. When the Buddha became enlightened, his very first teaching was that desire is the cause of all suffering. But we see this, you know, in most great religions, this idea that in order to become spiritually accomplished, one must put off the desires of the body, put off the lusts of the flesh, put off the longings of this physical reality. Point number 20, the importance of selfless service. You know, this really ties in with compassion, right? I chose the phrase selfless service because in many ways, you know, people talk about love in the context of religion today. They say God is love and it's all about love. But this word love in American popular culture often has strong romantic accents, right? This idea of romantic love, right? But romantic love is often self-seeking. It's often pleasure-based and centered on hedonism, right? Whereas selfless service is a very different kind of love. It's a sacrificial love. In fact, the Greeks didn't have just one word for love. They had several different words. And the word that's used in the Greek to describe Christian love is agape, this giving, self-sacrificing love that puts the interests of others ahead of yourself. This is the kind of love that is essential to most religious teaching. Point number 21, the importance of detachment. Now, this is something that I found personally really significant in my life, of letting go, trying to accept situations without wrestling with them so much, right? This is really central to Buddhism, right? The Buddha said that desire is the cause of all suffering, and the immediate function or the immediate result of desire is clinging, attachment, possessing. In fact, if you have any experience with the spirit world, you realize pretty quickly that pretty much anything of a spiritual nature has a profound aversion to attachment. I've pointed out in other videos how it's interesting, if you go to many temples and many churches or mosques, there's a prohibition against taking photographs, and this is due due to the fact that among many spiritual communities, it's felt that the spirits are offended by photos. And you say, why is that? Well, a photo is a possessive thing. It's owning something, grasping something, holding on to something, right? And this is really kryptonite to the spirit world, right? A detachment, letting go, this is central to an effective spiritual life. Jesus even goes so far as to say, sell everything you own, give the money to the poor, and then come and follow me. He says, whosoever clings to their life will lose it, but whosoever loses their life for my sake will keep it forevermore. Point number 22, the diversity of spirits. Now this is something that is kind of, flying in the face of a little bit of monotheism, right? It's rather interesting actually how in the West we have such a tremendous emphasis on the worship of one God, but even when you look through the Bible, there's a great deal of diversity among the spiritual beings. There are many different angels mentioned, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel. You have different demons mentioned, Satan, Azazel, and Abaddon, There's this sense that there are many different spiritual entities, and you see this through all the different religions of the world, this idea that there are many different devas, many different gods that exist out there beyond this physical reality. Point number 23, the emanations of Neoplatonism, the Amensha, Spentas, the Trinity, the Eons. What this refers to is a common theme that we see among many different religions, which emphasize the outflow of spiritual entities. There's a sense that, divinity is one, but divinities are many. In fact, this is a quote from the Dinka tribe of South Sudan, the tribe actually, in fact, my wife happens to belong to. And in their language, they say Neolach is one and Neolach is many. It's the sense that there is one all-pervading spirit, but that spirit manifests itself in many different ways. It has many different forms, many different emanations. You get this in the idea of the Trinity, the idea of the Gnostic Eons, or the emanations of Neoplatonism, right? The Amensha Spentas of Zoroastrianism were felt to be 7 spirits, of whom Ahura Mazda was comprised. And this brings us to point number 24, the unity and diversity of God. So this is this idea that God is one, but God is also simultaneously many. We see this even within the book of Genesis, where, God comes to Abraham as 3 separate individuals and yet remains one God. In fact, it's really odd in the Hebrew Bible, the word that's commonly translated as God is Elohim, which in Hebrew is plural. So most of the time when you see the word God in the Bible, it should perhaps be translated the gods, in fact. Point number 25, the idea of a conscious creator. Now this is one I find rather interesting because you find it in places you wouldn't expect. Obviously we see it in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, right? The idea of God is creating the universe. We see it also within Hinduism. We see it within Native American stories of Creator's son, Natosi, coming and creating the world with dust and space. But we also see it within traditions within Buddhism, which is kind of unexpected because Buddhists are traditionally thought of as atheists. But it's not, when you study Buddhist tradition, there's clear there are many different spirits, many different gods. But the reason they're usually described as atheists is because they don't put God in the central role of their religion. They put the Buddha in that position. And so, when the Buddhists talk about the creator, they speak of Brahma. They say that at the beginning of a universe, a Brahma is spontaneously born in that universe, and then he goes to work creating all these other forms of life. Point number 26, the primal man, Purusha, Adam, Vajradhara. This is the idea that at the beginning of the universe, at the beginning of creation, all religions seem to agree that there was some kind of primal being, some first man. Now it's interesting how different religions will adapt this. You have Adam in the Garden of Eden, who's created by God and lives in a paradise, and then due to sin is cast out. You have the idea of Ymir within Norse mythology, this first being who's then killed, and the various parts of his body are used by the lesser gods to construct the world. Within Hinduism, you have the idea of Purusha, very similar in fact. This idea of a giant who's killed and then the members of his body are used to construct the world. And in fact, what's really interesting is that the Hindus say that in order to achieve enlightenment, one must become Purusha, which seems rather strange, right? Why would you have to become a giant you know, in order to become enlightened. But that's not what they mean. What they're describing is this psychological state where in which one feels oneself to be at the very beginning of the universe. You know, the man who first discovered LSD said that when he had his first experience, he felt like he was Adam in the garden on the first day of creation, right? Many different religions emphasize this experience of achieving the state of mind equivalent to Adam. You know, this is really described also within Buddhism. It's said that when an individual has an experience of enlightenment and full realization, they attain to the state of mind equivalent to that of Vajradhara, the primordial Buddha, the first being. So there's this sense that within each and every one of us, there is this divine personality, this Purusha, this Atman, this Adam, and that we must come into union with that eternal primordial being in order to achieve spiritual realization and enlightenment. In fact, even Christ is referred to as the second Adam. Point number 27, the idea of Paradisal Realms. This is something we see in every religion, really. You know, the happy hunting grounds of the First Nations people, heaven within Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. We see moksha within Hinduism, the idea of achieving a reincarnation in the celestial realms of Lord Vishnu and living with him in eternity. Within Buddhism, we have the Buddha Pure Lands of Amitabha and the Buddha of compassion. It's this idea that if one is worthy of those primordial and celestial realms, that one can be reborn in this paradisal reality. Point number 28, the fall and the idea of original sin. I find this really interesting because we usually think of this as a very Catholic idea, but in fact we see it in many different religious traditions. It's become kind of popular in the New Age movement to speak of original innocence. You know, people are really offended by this idea of original sin, but it's a universal constituent of religious faith. Among the Blackfoot Indians of the Americas, it's said that in the beginning men lived forever. They had no old age, sickness, or death, but as a consequence of the woman, she tempted Nitosi with all these different things, and then as a result, Nitosi brought death into the world. Creator's Son brought death. Of course, we see this within Christianity, with the fall of Adam and Eve from the garden, within Judaism, within Islam. Even within Buddhism, it's said that at the beginning of the universe, when Brahma creates all things, everything is a paradisal reality, but the accumulation of negative karmas drives beings lower and lower into worse and worse states of existence. We hear stories in Africa about God living among men. In fact, there's this wonderful story that my wife told me where they say among the Dinka that God walked with men, and then one day man decided to plow the earth, and this offended God, and so as a consequence, God sent a little bird to cut the rope that ties heaven and earth together. And this brings us to point 29, the idea of a Messianic Saviour. Now this is really, I use the word Messianic, which is very Christian, but we see this really in pretty much every religion, at least on every continent anyway. You know, in Christianity, obviously, we have Christ, the Savior, who comes into the world. This is the hero's journey, right? The archetypal hero. But we see within Zoroastrian the idea of the Saoshyant, who will come and restore all things. We see the final incarnation of Vishnu as Kalki, who will come at the end of the age and restore the world and drive everyone into a paradisal reality. Maitreya, who will come as the final Buddha and set all things right and straight. And this brings us to point 30, the wish-fulfilling tree. Now, this is a Hindu phrase, but it is something we see in many, many different religions, right? The tree of life, the wish-fulfilling tree. This is the tree upon which Christ was crucified, the tree under which the Buddha sat when he achieved realization and enlightenment. It's this symbology of the tree. The tree is this eternal symbol that in many ways may represent the chakra system or the ladder of the wise. It's this thing that connects heaven and earth. And the tree is a generous source of bounty. It shares its bounty with all the world. And so this imagery of the wish-fulfilling tree, the divine tree, is something we see in many different religious traditions. In fact, among the Norse, there's this image of Yggdrasil that holds all of Asgard and the whole reality of this universe together. Something we also see among the Amazonian shamans, this idea that the universe is suspended in the branches of a great cosmic tree. Now, another common theme, point number 31, is the idea of crucifixion, wherein which one is nailed to a tree or suspended from a tree, impaled upon a tree. This is a common mythological theme that we see all around the world. My favorite example of this actually comes from the Blackfoot traditions of the Plains Indians, how they describe the founding of the Sundance religion, where Scarface had to travel out to the Western Sea, where he was helped by swans to reach the home of Creator Sun. And once he got there, Creator Sun explained to him that in order to marry the virgin daughter of the chief, he must be crucified on a cottonwood tree and hang for 4 days and wear a crown of juniper berries, and if he survives the ordeal and emerges from this experience, he'll be allowed to marry the virgin daughter of the chief. Sounds familiar, right? This is a form of imagery that we see in many different traditions all around the world. And tied in intimately with it, in point 32, is the image of the serpent upon the tree. We see this in the Garden of Eden, where the snake tempts Eve with the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. We see this imagery of the Nehushtan, when Moses is in the wilderness. He lifts up the snake on a bronze pole in the desert. Christ describes himself as the Nehushtan, saying, just as Moses lifted up the bronze snake in the wilderness, so too must the Son of Man be lifted up. We see this within Greek mythology in the form of Asclepius's wand or Hermes' wand, right? This image of the serpent on the pole. Even on the flag of Mexico, you have the image of a serpent in the talons of a falcon standing on a cactus tree. This was a story about the founding of the city of Mexico City. So this imagery of a serpent suspended on a tree is really iconography that describes the death of the ego, the death of egoism, crucifying the ego, lifting it up off of the ground, detaching it from its attachment to material things, and elevating it into a spiritual realm. And this is often associated with point number 33, the idea of the axis mundi. Now, this really is a universal mythological theme. Almost every culture, every tradition has some kind of an image of some location here on Earth that represents the center of the universe. For many years, people felt that Jerusalem was the center of the Earth. According to Buddhist tradition, Bodh Gaya in India, where the Buddha achieved enlightenment, was the axis mundi, the center of the universe. Usually, communities would choose a sacred location and describe this as the central mound of the world. This in many ways was a metaphor pointing people to the immovable spot within themselves, this idea of a solid and unmoving state of mind, a focused and meditative state of mind that sits at the center of all things. Point number 34, the imagery of the divine sun. This is something that found a particularly big form of expression in the Americas among the native Indians. It's remarkable if you travel over the whole continent of America, South America and North America. Pretty well every native culture in the Americas worship the sun. You have the Sun Temple in Teotihuacan down in Mexico, and the Blackfoot natives up in the plains were worshiping Natosi, Creator Sun. You see this even out on the East Coast, this prominence of the divine sun. In fact, the first form of proper monotheism that we see historically was probably the monotheism of Akhenaten in Egypt, who commanded all the Egyptians to exclusively worship the Aten, the sun disk. The sun is, of course, the icon and the symbol of eternal life. This is identified really, I think, in a big way with point number 35, the idea of the white light. This is something we see described in many different religious traditions. Of course, people in the West now have, these heart attack experiences, near-death experiences. They describe seeing a white light at the end of the tunnel. They move up towards it, right? And it's God. It's the essence of God. Now, it seems the divinity of the sun was intimately tied in with this. It seems to me that many cultures identified the sun as God because they thought of the sun as being the white light that people would see when they would die.
The royal falcon is flown into the sun.
This is something we see expressed beautifully in the Upanishads, where it says, this man's praying to the sun and saying, remove this veil of gold from your face. He's saying, in mystical experiences, the sun is white, but for some reason, when I'm awake, the sun is yellow, right? So he's saying, remove this veil of gold so that I can see your pure and true essence as you really are, right? We see this even within most religions, in fact. In the iconography of saints, when they have a halo around their head, right? This describes the position of spiritual awakening, achieving to the highest chakra, an experience of full spiritual enlightenment. Point number 36, the flood and the watery depths. This is something we see remarkably among many, many different religious traditions. This idea that there was a world flood. You know, it says in First Nations mythology that the world was flooded and that Trickster Nappy rode upon a raft with beaver and muskrat, and they worked together in constructing a new world. Of course, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh and the stories of Noah, but we see these kinds of stories in many different societies. It says that at the beginning of time, when Vishnu wanted to create the universe for the Hindus, he dove into the sea as a boar and then brought up mud to help construct the world, the goddess Mother Earth. This imagery of the watery depths is itself a metaphor for the unconscious mind. Descending below the surface of the water is descending into the world of dreams, descending into the world of the unconscious. We see this in baptism when Christians descend into the water and are said to have been baptized into the death of Christ. We see this among the Arthurian myths when the Lady of the Lake comes up from such a place. Among the First Nations people in South America, you find evidence that they were throwing sacred objects into watery pools called cenotes, and it was felt that as soon as the object crossed the surface of the water, it would slip into the spirit world. Point number 37, the immortality of the heart. This is something, again, we see many, many different places. You have Vajradhara, the Buddha of the eternal life within the heart, right? Jesus' sacred heart, Mary's immaculate heart, Vishnu living in the heart of everyone. My favorite expression of this comes actually from Labrador, Canada. And the reason I find it so compelling is because it's imagery that was brought up independent of any other religious tradition. Among the Naskapi Indians of Labrador, it is said that within each native Naskapi is Mistapeo, my good friend, who lives in the heart of everyone, and he sends the Naskapi good dreams to help him understand the weather, to lead him to good hunting grounds, and if the Naskapi lives with a moral and integrity-filled life, then Mistapeo will help him, and he worships his god, Mistapeo, by expressing the imagery of his dreams in art and presenting that around him. And it's felt that at the moment of death, my good friend Mistapeo leaves the Naskapi and then is reincarnated within someone else. It's this idea that within us, within this divine nature within the heart, the Atman, the eternal one that dwells within, there is this profound sense of fulfillment and immortality. Number 38, the importance of mandalas. This is really interesting because it's something that we see in Hinduism, Buddhism especially, but really we find it in many different places. And this draws back in many ways to the axis mundi, this idea of a centrality, a fixed point within the universe. I often like to say the galaxy we live in is really a mandala, you know, with a black hole, the singularity, the end of time at the center, and we're all revolving around. Carl Gustav Jung used to say that the most important spiritual symbol is that of the circle. The circle is the most important icon of spirituality, and you see this among especially Aboriginal communities. It's the idea of everything cycling, everything coming around. You know, what goes around comes around, so to speak, right?
Some observers say a key to the old religion is to be found in the circle. The power of the world works in circles. The sky is round. The stars and the earth are round. The seasons form a great circle. The life of a man is a circle from childhood to childhood. And so it is in everything where power moves.
And the mandala serves to separate pairs of opposites psychologically. What's really interesting is when we look at the cosmologies of ancient people, they would almost always render their universe in the form of a mandala, which really helps us to understand that in fact they were building these maps of their world through visions and dreams, and their iconography, their symbolism was not so much drawing a map of the physical world as it was so much drawing a map of their psyche. Point number 39, the spirit of evil and demons. This really is something, unfortunately, we see among almost every religion. You have the devil within Christianity, Mara within Buddhism, Yama within Hinduism, right? This idea of a dark lord and his minions who tempt people with evil longings. It's felt among most religions that most of our evil instincts and our evil inclinations come from the influence of these whispering demon entities who come and try to compel us into harmful actions. And point number 40, misfortune is punishment. This is something we see among pretty well every religion, this idea that if an individual leads a sinful life, if they listen to the whisperings of the devils, then they'll find misfortune throughout your life. You have the idea of karma in the East, the punishment of God in the West, and the favor of Nitosi in the Americas, right? It's this idea that our spiritual lives evoke fortunes and misfortune. In fact, the word fortune comes from the old Greek and Roman word fortuna, which means the favor of the gods. So if you've lived as a good human being, you've done a good life, then you'll have fortuna, the favor of the gods. So I hope this gives you guys some interesting things to chew on. You know, I often talk on this channel about the importance of the universality of these religious themes, and I hope that this gives you the sense that really, you know, there's more that religions agree on than disagree on, and we have a great deal of debate in terms of the differences, but the differences are often minor. You know, it's more on the small points rather than the big themes. And so for me, you know, meditating on these things, observing these things, definitely gives me the sense that there is a universal truth behind religion and mythology. So I hope that this will help you guys find the confidence to move forward with an authentic spiritual life. And as always, thanks for watching.